think of Bloodborne and its story, usually the thought of H.P Lovecraft and his horror-filled eldritch monster creations comes to mind. While exploring the Gothic architecture and trying not to repeatedly die, you kind of forget that you're playing a game developed by a Japanese studio. The DLC, The Old Hunters, is pretty much the best part of the game, from the environments, the boss fights, the music, and the story. Now, the story is where things get very interesting. Like the rest of the game, you might come to the conclusion that this too is based on H.P Lovecraft. But in all actuality, it's based on Japanese folklore and myths. In fact, the same studio that created Bloodborne have already told the story in a previous game that's overflowing with Japanese horror, Siren. So stick with me as I attempt to give some insight into the links between Bloodborne, Siren, and Japanese folklore, while trying not to sound like I've gone mad. So let's start with a specific Japanese story that I believe influenced both games: whale cults. Quick history lesson. In times before Japanese boats could go deep out into the sea, very rarely whales would beach themselves ashore, providing nearby villages with a bounty of meat and resources. A single whale could save an entire village from starvation. I mean, whales are enormous. Not understanding why such a creature would seemingly swim itself up onto land, the villagers could only really sum it up to the whales being a gift from the gods. This would develop into them worshipping the whales and cults forming, with the term
漂着神、漂着神
referring to this phenomenon of these whales beaching themselves. The term essentially meaning a drifting ashore god. So some quick clarification. When I say cult, we usually automatically associate that with negative things like murder cults. But in this context, it's just a group of people with religious veneration towards whales. Nothing really bad about it. Now keep this in mind. Eventually, multiple different whale cults would merge with the idea of a more popular god, Ebisu, a Japanese god of luck, specifically in reference to the fishermen and tradesmen. Because of this, whales were soon thought of as incarnations of the god himself, visiting the people to give them a bounty. That's just the base of it though. There's so much more that I could talk about regarding this, but you didn't come here for a history lesson, you came here for Bloodborne and some horror. So, what does all this have to do with Bloodborne? In the Bloodborne DLC, you visit an area called the Fishing Hamlet, an old village that's now been twisted and turned into a sort of nightmare plane. Previously, the Fishing Hamlet had the body of a great one washed ashore on its beach. Without overcomplicating it, great ones in Bloodborne are basically gods, beings on a higher plane of existence, similar to how, in real life, cults were formed around whales, revering them as gods. The villagers of the Fishing Hamlet would start to worship this dead great one, who would be known as Cause. Along with its body, Cause also brought a bounty of parasites to the village, and not just any average parasites, but parasites from a god. We never really know what state the village was in before Cause arrived, but the villagers started harvesting these parasites by eating them, which is gross, but hey, if there was a famine going on, you gotta do what you gotta do, and if there wasn't a famine, well, gross. Because of all this otherworldly ingestion, the villagers themselves started to mutate into half-man, half-fish beings, but still seemed to go about their daily routines as well as worship Cause. Now, a god washing up near a village isn't an everyday occasion, and word would spread all the way to the Bergenworth College, a school obsessed with the study of the Great Ones and putting human knowledge on a higher plane of existence, just like the Great Ones. Hearing about the deceased Cause, the school would hire hunters to head over to the Fishing Hamlet and essentially massacre the villagers in their quest for knowledge and research, even going as far as to drill holes in their heads and desecrating the body of a god. This horrible event would not go unnoticed by Cause though. And now you're probably asking, isn't Cause dead though? Well, even though a great one's body can perish, their consciousness can still exist. Just the usual god things. So, being a god, Cause cast a curse on the hunters that perpetrated the massacre, causing them to be trapped in a nightmare realm, forced to kill beasts over and over for an eternity, unable to truly die. The curse also extended to any future hunters that would succumb to bloodlust while hunting, meaning when their mortal bodies died, their consciousness would be transported to this nightmare realm as well. A sort of twisted immortality if you think about it. This is pretty much the basis for the Bloodborne DLC, and now you can see the parallels between that of the fishing hamlet and Japanese history. As for the curse, I didn't include this earlier because I can't find the original source of this Japanese urban legend, and it might not even exist on the internet in English, but it's interesting nonetheless. The urban legend tells a story of a village going through an intense famine. People are dying every day. Suddenly, they are visited by a creature with the head of a cow and the body of a man. Seeing him as a source of food, the villagers attack the man, tearing him to shreds, literally eating him alive. After this, the village is cursed, and what's available of the story ends with the moral being, don't be greedy. Greed brings doom. Just like how the hunters and the scholars in Bloodborne were greedy for knowledge and brought doom upon themselves, mixing this with real life history and culture, you get the story of the DLC. Now, keep this urban legend in mind too, because it also applies to another game, a horror game. In Siren, which was released in the US in 2004, the story goes something like this. Long before the events of a game, a god named Dadatsushi fell from the heavens and into Hanada village, where the game takes place. When it lands in the village, Dadatsushi is just kind of stuck where it lands, as it looks not fully developed, or just like a fish out of water. It would soon be discovered by villagers who were in the midst of a famine. Due to this and the fact that, well, Dadatsushi looks like a really weird fish, the villagers ate it alive. With its last breath, Dadatsushi cursed the villagers, killing all of them except for one woman, Hisako Yao, who would be made immortal and forced to repent by eternally working to revive the god. He would also go on to form a religion, a cult, to worship Dadatsushi. They would start to regularly perform rituals and attempt to make Dadatsushi whole again. And this all happens before the events of the game, just like what happened with Cause in Bloodborne. And just like the hunters, Hisako is cursed with a kind of immortality that even extends to her direct descendants, who are unable to properly die even after their flesh is long gone. During the game, this red water can be seen around, and the water is essentially the blood of Dadatsushi. Those who drink from it are slowly transformed into Shibito, the enemies of the game. So think of the red water as the parasites from Kos and Bloodborne. Though unlike the residents of the fishing hamlet who would primarily take on a fishman look, the Shibito of Siren have a more varied transformations, with only some of them taking on marine-like features. The game also takes place in Hanada village, which has been pulled into another dimension at the start of the game due to the failure of one of those rituals I just mentioned. And if you're wondering, the exact myth that this is referencing is the one of Yaobakuni, a legendary traveling nun. The main points of the myth are that a girl unknowingly eats the flesh of something from the underworld. You see where I'm going with this? Because of this, she seemingly stops aging. I have to give a huge thanks to Eurothug 4000 and Tango Mushi for their well-crafted, in-depth videos on Siren, because the story can be quite hard to piece together, and 10-year-old me was not understanding any of this the first time I played it. If you have any interest in Siren from what I've been talking about, please go give their videos a watch. It was only after watching both of their videos that I realized how similar some of the concepts and the story were to Bloodborne. I have some extras to talk about as well, just things that I noticed while doing research that didn't really fit into my main comparisons, so I'll throw them in here. Remember that Japanese urban legend that I mentioned earlier? The one about the person with the head of a cow and the body of a man? Without going too deep, in Japanese culture and Buddhism, he's part of a pair that guard the underworld. The other one is known as Mezu and has the head of a horse and the body of a man, which made me do some thinking. As far as I know, there's no explanation of why Ludwig, one of the bosses of the DLC, looks like a horse. Well, besides the constant berserk references, but the area we find him in kind of looks almost like hell, with the arena literally being a pool of blood with corpses piled high along the room. In order to continue further in the DLC, you have to defeat Ludwig in order to delve deeper into the nightmare. Dive deeper into hell. This is only speculation, but it almost seems way too coincidental considering the rest of the story having similarities to Japanese culture. And then a boss that blocks your progress looks like a horse who guards the gates of hell in Japanese Buddhism. I may be reaching, but I'll leave that up to you guys. Now that I've yapped to you about Bloodborne, Siren, and Japanese folklore for a bit, let's go over everything really quick because it's a lot, I know. In Bloodborne and Siren, a fish-like god appears in a village, causing some people to defile parts of it. In Bloodborne, the hunters slaughtered the villagers and defiled the god. In Siren, Hisako ate parts of the god due to a famine going on in her village. In both games, the gods cursed the perpetrators with a twisted form of immortality. The hunters stuck in a dreamlike dimension even after their mortal body dies. Hisako Yao and her bloodline forced to live centuries despite their flesh rotting away. In Japanese culture, whales that washed ashore near villages were seen as gifts from the gods. In myths, people who violate these gods by eating them were cursed, and in the case of Yabukuni, she was cursed with eternal life. So now you can see just how similar all these stories are and the connections Bloodborne and Siren have with Japanese folklore. I've told you the same story 3 times with slight variations. Pretty cool, right? I was a little hesitant about making this video as I'm not a native Japanese person, which meant researching topics that I'm not too familiar with. I hope I didn't do too bad of a job explaining it, and if you do play through the Bloodborne DLC, you'll see it in a different light. Or maybe you just learned something new. Now keep in mind that this was just what I managed to deduce from all the similarities that we've talked about. There could be something there, or I could be losing my mind. After all, this is just a theory. A game. I tried to make sure the audio was better for this video as I did read all of your comments on my last video. Hopefully this was a much better listening experience for you guys. And as always, thank you for the feedback and support. Until next time.